She was 23 when Julian filed. There was no conversation, no final, fracturing argument. There was only a manila envelope on the polished granite countertop of the kitchen they had, until that morning, shared. Inside was a single key to the apartment, a copy of the legal separation notice, and a meticulously itemized list of assets he had already secured. He took the joint bank account, draining it to a precise zero. He took the Danish mid-century sofa and the matching armchairs they had spent a month searching for. He took the commissioned oil painting that hung over the bed, the one he always said was a sound investment. He took the heirloom silver that had been her mother's, noting its scrap value on his list. He took the lease, his name having been the primary, a detail he had insisted upon a year earlier for reasons of simplicity. He had been methodical. He had been efficient. He had been thorough in the specific way of a person who believes a life can be accounted for on a spreadsheet. He had taken everything he could count, everything he could document, everything he could assign a value to. He never asked about the one thing she had that did not appear on any ledger. He had completely forgotten the abandoned Coastguard station on the far northern coast, the one her grandmother had left her in a will scribbled on the back of a nautical chart. It was a ruin, a liability. It had no quantifiable worth. She had grown up understanding the ocean the way some children grow up understanding silence. It was not an absence but a presence, a constant breathing entity with its own language of swells and currents, of scoured winds and the deep, resonant tolling of the bellbuoy in the fog. Her grandmother, Ilara, had been her tutor in this language. Clara spent her childhood summers at the old station, a place the government had decommissioned decades before Ilara, in a fit of stubborn love for the sea that had claimed her husband, had acquired for back taxes, and a promise to maintain the light. It was a promise she kept, unofficially, for 40 years, becoming a fixture of the coast, a woman as weathered and reliable as the granite cliffs themselves. Clara learned the tides not from a book, but from the dark, wet lines on the pier pilings. She learned weather patterns from the particular quality of the light on the water, the shape of the clouds massing over the horizon. She learned the intricate, life-saving geometries of knots, her small fingers following Ilara's gnarled, capable hands as they looped and tightened lengths of stiff rope, each knot a sentence in a language of pure function. The bowline that would not slip, the clove hitch that held fast, the anchor bend that secured them to the earth. Ilara was a woman carved from the same material as the coastline she watched over. She was quiet, but her silence was one of competence, not absence. She had arrived on that coast as a young bride, following her husband, a fisherman whose laughter was as loud as the gulls. He was a man who understood the sea as a partner, a provider, a vast and beautiful mystery. But the sea was a partner that did not always return what it was given. One autumn, a squall had appeared from nowhere, a sudden, violent erasure of the horizon, and his boat, the Tern, did not come back. The town expected her to leave. They expected her to sell the small cottage and return to the inland city where she was from, to a life of softer edges and more predictable sorrows. But Ilara had stayed. The sea had taken her husband, and in a strange, defiant act of love, she had decided to dedicate her life to it. She bought the old Coastguard station, a place of watchfulness and waiting, and made it her own. She did not rail against her loss. Instead, she immersed herself in the deep knowledge of the place that had caused it. She charted the currents, recorded the migratory patterns of the seabirds, and learned the names of every rock and shoal that could tear the hull of a boat. She became a living repository of the coast's secrets, a quiet guardian who asked for nothing in return. She worked with a patience that Clara would later understand was a form of grace, a way of moving through the world that did not demand but simply observed, understood, and endured. Clara met Julian during her final year of her marine biology studies. He was an architecture student, and he was attentive in the specific way that lonely people find irresistible. He listened. He asked questions. He seemed fascinated by her quiet world, by her stories of the station, of her grandmother, of a life so different from his own urban, structured existence. He saw her, she thought, as something unique, something authentic in a world he found increasingly synthetic. But she learned over the course of their 5 years together that he was not seeing her, but rather a concept of her that fit neatly into the life he was designing. He loved the idea of her connection to the sea. He did not love the damp chill of the fog in her hair or the scent of salt that clung to her skin. He admired the story of her grandmother's resilience. He had no patience for the slow, unglamorous work of actual repair or maintenance. Their life together became a collection he curated. He chose the apartment for its clean lines and investment potential. He chose their friends from circles that could advance his career. He chose their vacations based on what would look most impressive in a photograph. He had, in his own way, been decommissioning her life, stripping it of its messy, unpredictable, unquantifiable elements and replacing them with polished, valuable surfaces. The marriage had been his idea, another acquisition, another box checked. The separation, she now saw, was simply a liquidation. She had ceased to be an asset that appreciated in value. She had become a liability, a reminder of a world that could not be measured, a world that did not perform to his expectations. And so he had divested, cleanly and completely. With the $217 she had in her wallet and a single duffel bag containing her field journals, a few changes of clothes, and a worn copy of The Ashley Book of Knots, Clara bought a one-way bus ticket north. The city dissolved behind her in a smear of gray glass and rain-slicked asphalt. For hours she watched the landscape change, the dense geometry of the suburbs giving way to rolling farmland, then to the dark, imposing forests of the north. The air itself seemed to shift, losing its metallic, exhaust-tinged edge and taking on the clean, cold scent of pine and wet earth. By the second day, she began to smell the salt, a faint, familiar tang that was more memory than scent. The bus was a slow, lumbering creature, stopping in towns whose names she had only ever seen on maps. It was a gradual unwinding, a peeling back of the layers of the life she had been living, until all that was left was the core of her, the part that remembered the feel of a rope in her hands and the sound of the tide turning. She arrived in Port Fulton, a town that clung to the edge of the continent like a barnacle. The sky was a low, uniform gray, and a fine mist was falling, blurring the edges of the fishing boats in the harbor. The air was thick with the smells of diesel, brine, and frying fish. She walked to the small law office of Abernathy and Son, a name she knew from her grandmother's sparse correspondence. Mr. Abernathy was old, his face a creased map of his own long life on this coast. He remembered her. He remembered Ilara. He looked at her not with pity but with a quiet, knowing respect. He retrieved a heavy manila folder from a filing cabinet that looked as old as he was. Inside were the deed, filed and official, and a large, ornate brass key attached to a simple loop of twine. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he said, his voice raspy, like shells being dragged over sand. "She believed this place was not about ownership, but about stewardship. She said it was waiting for the right hands." He pushed the folder and the key across the worn surface of his desk. "Welcome home, Clara." The station was 2 miles out of town, at the end of a winding, unpaved road. It stood on a spit of granite, a lonely sentinel facing the vast, gray expanse of the ocean. It was worse than she remembered, but also better. The white paint was peeling in long strips, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath. The windows of the main house were clouded with salt spray and grime, and a few were boarded up. The metal roof of the watchtower was rusted in great, weeping streaks of orange. It looked derelict, abandoned. But as she got closer, she saw what Julian, with his architect's eye for flaws, would never have seen. She saw the foundation, solid granite, anchored to the bedrock of the point itself. She saw the strength in the thick, hand-hewn timbers of the walls, the honest, unadorned functionality of its design. It had good bones. It had been built to withstand a century of storms, and it had. She fitted the heavy brass key into the lock of the main door. It was stiff, resistant. She had to put her shoulder into it, and for a moment she thought it was rusted shut. Then, with a deep, groaning complaint, the lock turned. The door swung inward on a wave of cold, musty air that smelled of damp wood, salt, and the slow, patient work of decay. The inside was a landscape of dust and neglect. Furniture was draped in white cloths, now gray with grime, like sleeping ghosts. But it was all there. Her grandmother's charts were still rolled in their cubbies in the map room. Her collection of sea glass was still arranged by color on the deep windowsill. It was a place where time had not so much stopped as settled, like silt at the bottom of a deep pool. For 2 days she explored, reacquainting herself with the station's geography. She swept away the thickest layers of dust, opened windows to let the clean, salt air chase out the stale ghosts of the past. She felt a deep, primal sense of homecoming, the kind of belonging that sinks into your bones. On the 3rd day, she was in the small map room, running her hands over the smooth, worn wood of the chart table. She remembered her grandmother telling her a story about the station's first keeper, a man who didn't trust banks and believed the safest place was always beneath your own feet. Acting on a sudden, illogical impulse, Clara knelt and examined the wide plank floorboards. One, near the wall beneath the chart cubbies, seemed to have a slightly different color, a less uniform layer of dust along its seams. She used the tip of her rigging knife to pry at the edge. It was stuck fast. She found a small crowbar in a tool closet and, with a great deal of effort, managed to lever the board up. It came away with a long, screeching protest. Beneath it, nestled in the dark, cool space of the crawlspace, was a heavy, iron-banded sea chest. It was not locked. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, the air was dry and smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. On top lay a thick, sealed envelope addressed to her in Ilara's familiar, spidery script. Beneath it, bundled in oilcloth and tied with twine, were stacks of old bills, 20s, 50s, hundreds, and several small, heavy canvas bags. She untied one of the bags and poured its contents onto the dusty floor. Gold coins, mostly American eagles, gleamed with a soft, warm light in the dim room. She spent the next hour counting. There were bundles of cash and bags of coins. When she was done, the total came to just over $47,000. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. It was enough to begin again. With trembling hands, she opened the letter. The paper was thick and creamy, the ink slightly faded. "My dearest Clara," it began, "if you are reading this, it means you have come home. I hope it was not sorrow that brought you here, but if it was, know that this place is good for that. It holds sorrow the way the sea holds the rain, taking it in and making it part of a larger whole. This place is your anchor, child. Some people build their lives on shifting sand, on things that can be bought and sold and washed away in the first storm. They will never understand that true value is in the things that endure. This station has endured. It has faced gales that could strip a house to its foundation, and it has held. It has held because it is built on rock, and it was built with honest hands. The money in this chest is for the things that need buying. The roof will need seeing to first. There is a man in town, Silas Croft. His father helped me put the last roof on. He is an honest man who understands old buildings. Tell him Ilara sent you. But the money is the least of what I leave you. I leave you this place, this view, this wind. I leave you the knowledge that you come from a long line of people who knew how to hold fast, how to read the weather, how to mend what is broken. That is a legacy worth more than all the gold in the world. A person who can't see the value in a well-tied knot or a solid foundation will never be able to see the value in you, my girl. Never forget that. Your home is not four walls. It is the strength in your own two hands. With all my love, your grandmother, Ilara. Clara sat on the dusty floor, the letter in her lap and the gold coins cool against her palm, and she cried. She wept for her grandmother, for the life she had lost with Julian, for the profound, unexpected grace of this discovery. The tears were not of sorrow, but of a deep, cleansing release. Ilara's words were a balm, a validation of a truth she had known in her bones, but had allowed herself to forget. She was not the fragile, impractical person Julian had seen. She was the granddaughter of the woman who kept the light. The next morning she walked into town and found the offices of Croft and Son Roofing. Silas Croft was a man in his late 50s, with a face as weathered as the shingles he replaced and hands that looked strong enough to anchor a ship. When she said her grandmother's name, his expression softened. "Ilara," he said, a smile touching the corners of his mouth. She was one of a kind, drove a harder bargain than any fisherman in this town, but always fair, always. Your station, huh? I was wondering when someone would finally give it the attention it deserves. Let's go have a look. He followed her out in his work truck, and for an hour he walked the roof, pulling at shingles, checking the flashing around the chimney, his movements economical and sure. He came down and gave her a quote that was, she knew, far less than the work was worth. "We'll start Monday," he said. "Consider it a professional courtesy for Ilara." The work began. Silas and his two sons swarmed over the roof, their hammers creating a steady, rhythmic percussion that became the new heartbeat of the station. But Clara was not a passive observer. She was there every day, from the cold, misty dawn until the light failed in the evening. She hauled bundles of new cedar shingles up the ladder. She learned how to lay them, how to find the right overlap, how to drive the nails home with 3 clean strikes. She learned the satisfying ache in her shoulders and back at the end of a long day of physical labor. She worked alongside them, her initial awkwardness giving way to a steady competence. Silas, after a day of watching her, gave a single approving nod. "You've got your grandmother's hands," he said, which Clara took as the highest possible praise. While they worked on the roof, she worked on the rest of the station. She scraped the old, flaking paint from the siding, the repetitive motion of the scraper, a kind of meditation. She sanded the wood smooth, feeling the grain come alive under her fingers. She reglazed the old, wavy glass of the windows, a slow, meticulous process that required a steady hand and infinite patience. Day by day, week by week, the station began to transform. It was not a renovation in the way Julian would have understood it. She was not gutting it, not replacing its character with modern fixtures. She was restoring it. She was tending to it, healing it. She cleaned the great brass lens of the lantern until it shone with a brilliance that seemed to gather and amplify the light of even the grayest day. She polished every piece of brass hardware, doorknobs, hinges, cleats, until they gleamed with the warm, soft glow of old gold. She cleaned the map room with the care of a librarian, unrolling the old charts, gently cleaning them and placing them back in their homes. She found her grandmother's logs, decades of careful observations of the wind and the waves, and she began a new one, her own neat script filling the pages next to Ilara's. She painted the exterior a clean, brilliant white, and the trim a deep sea green. The station began to shine on its point of rock, a beacon once more. She made the space her own, but in a way that honored what it had been. She did not throw out Ilara's old furniture. She repaired it. She reupholstered the faded cushions of the armchair that sat by the main window with a simple, durable canvas. She sanded and refinished the great oak table in the common room. She set up her own workspace in a corner of the map room, her laptop and scientific instruments looking perfectly at home next to her grandmother's antique sextant and parallel rulers. The house began to breathe again, to live. The work was hard, but it was honest. Every evening she would fall into her bed, her body aching with a satisfying weariness, and sleep a deep, dreamless sleep, the sound of the surf a constant lullaby. She was not just rebuilding a house, she was rebuilding herself. Each nail she drove, each window she glazed was an act of reclamation, a quiet declaration of her own endurance. After 2 months of relentless work, the major repairs were done. The station was sound, weatherproof, and clean. The money from the sea chest was dwindling, but she had used it well. She needed to find work. She walked into the Port Fulton Marine Science Institute, a small, privately funded research facility, with a copy of her curriculum vitae and a quiet sense of purpose. The director, a woman named Dr. Eris, looked over her qualifications with a raised eyebrow. "Impressive," she said. "You did your thesis on benthic ecosystems in cold water environments. We have a grant for exactly that." Then she looked up, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Clara, you're Ilara's granddaughter, aren't you? I remember you from when you were a girl. Your grandmother taught me more about the intertidal zone than I ever learned in a university." She smiled. "We have a part-time research assistant position open. It's mostly sample collection and data entry, but it's a start. Can you begin next week?" Her new life found its rhythm. 3 days a week she worked at the institute, wading into the cold, clear water to collect samples. Her mind sharp and engaged, her professional skills valued and put to good use. The work connected her to the community of scientists and researchers, people who spoke her language, who understood the quiet thrill of discovery. On her days off, she worked on her own project. She began charting the complex tidal currents around the point, using a combination of modern GPS trackers and the old observational methods her grandmother had taught her. She spent hours in the lantern room, which she had converted into an observation post, watching the water, making notes, drawing charts. It was work that was both scientifically rigorous and deeply personal. It was a continuation of her grandmother's legacy, a conversation across time with the woman who had shaped her. The town began to accept her presence, not as a visitor, but as one of their own. Fishermen would stop by on their way out of the harbor, offering her a share of their catch. An elderly woman who had been Ilara's closest friend brought her a sourdough starter that she claimed was a direct descendant of a starter Ilara had used. A local historian came to visit, eager to see the restored station, and spent an entire afternoon sharing stories of its history, of the ships it had saved, of the keepers who had manned it. They spoke of her grandmother with a mixture of reverence and affection, their stories painting a portrait of a woman even more remarkable than Clara had known. In their memories, Ilara was a force of nature, a quiet pillar of the community. And in their acceptance of Clara, they were confirming her place in that lineage. She was no longer just Clara. She was Ilara's granddaughter, and that meant something here. It was an identity that could not be bought or listed on a spreadsheet. It was earned, inherited, and lived. She found a quiet joy in this new life, a deep sense of peace that she had never known in the city with Julian. Her days were full of meaningful work, of the simple pleasures of a cup of hot coffee watching the sunrise over the water, of the profound satisfaction of knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. It was a bright, clear day in late August when he arrived. The summer had been kind, and the station was surrounded by a riot of wildflowers. Clara was on the main deck, mending a fishing net, a skill she had been teaching herself, her fingers moving with growing confidence through the intricate patterns. A car door slammed, the sound alien and intrusive in the quiet air. She looked up and saw him standing at the end of the path. It was Julian. He was wearing a pair of expensive hand-stitched Italian loafers, completely unsuited for the gravel and dirt. He had on a tailored linen jacket and sunglasses that hid his eyes. He looked clean, polished, and utterly out of place, like a museum piece set down in a wilderness. He walked slowly toward her, his eyes scanning the station, a look of profound bewilderment on his face. He took in the clean white paint, the gleaming windows, the solid new roof. He saw the neat coils of rope on the cleats, the healthy herb garden she had planted in old wooden barrels, the quiet, competent way she sat there, holding a needle and twine. This was not the ruin he had dismissed. This was not the helpless, fragile woman he had left. He stopped a few feet from her, a look on his face she had never seen before, a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been regret. "Clara," he said, his voice uncertain. "Oh, I was in the area for a development project. I heard you were here." He gestured vaguely at the station. "I had no idea. I didn't know she left you this." The confession hung in the air between them. He hadn't known. He had been so focused on cataloging their shared assets that he had never bothered to learn about her inheritance, her history, her family. It had not been on his radar because it had no immediate market value. He had not been thorough enough. Clara set down the net, her movements calm and deliberate. She was surprised to find that she felt nothing. No anger, no pain, only a vast, quiet distance. She looked at him, at the man she had once thought she loved, and saw a stranger. She saw a man who could only perceive the world through a lens of profit and loss. He could see the restored building, and he could calculate its new, higher value. He could see that he had made a miscalculation. What he could not see was the work, the legacy, the meaning. He could not see the generations of resilience that lived in the station's walls. He could not see the strength in her hands that had come from her grandmother. "You never once asked about her," Clara said. Her voice was not accusatory. It was a simple statement of fact. "In all the years we were together, you never asked about this place. You never asked about her life." Julian had the grace to look away, out at the endless expanse of the ocean. He seemed to shrink inside his expensive jacket. The confidence he always wore like a second skin had vanished. "I didn't," he admitted quietly. He looked back at her, a desperate, searching look in his eyes. "Clara, I was wrong. About a lot of things. Is there anything left to salvage?" The word hung in the air. Salvage. It was his language, the language of assets and recovery, of assessing damage and calculating worth. He was asking if their relationship could be treated like a wreck, its valuable parts pulled from the debris. She looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a final, gentle click of understanding. He would never change. He would never understand. He would always be counting. "No," she said, the word soft but absolute. "No, there isn't." He held her gaze for a long moment, searching for a crack, an opening, a sign of her old deference. He found none. He found only a calm, clear-eyed certainty. He gave a small, defeated nod. He did not argue. He did not plead. He simply turned and walked away, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel path. She watched him get into his luxury car and drive away, a plume of dust rising behind him, until the sound of the engine faded and was replaced once more by the cry of the gulls and the gentle wash of the waves against the shore. That evening, Clara climbed the winding stairs to the lantern room. She sat in the old wooden chair her grandmother had favored and watched as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beam of the restored light began its slow, sweeping turn, a steady pulse of light in the growing darkness. She thought of Julian. He had tried to take her future by taking her money, her home, her possessions. He had believed that in leaving her with nothing, he was leaving her powerless. But he had been looking at the wrong ledger. He had been counting the wrong things. He could not see the inheritance that truly mattered, the resilience baked into her bones, the competence settled in her hands, the deep, quiet knowledge of who she was and where she came from. He could not quantify the value of a place built to withstand storms or the legacy of a woman who had taught her how to do the same. Julian had taken everything he could count. He had taken the furniture he could sell and the silver he could weigh. He had taken the numbers in the bank account and the equity in the lease. He had left behind the only thing that mattered. He forgot the salt-scoured Coastguard station her grandmother left. It was the best thing he ever forgot.